Hello, I'm Philip Morris from Proctors. I'm substituting for Karen Johnson today. December 1st, 2017. I demanded that I replace Karen on this one because this interview for the Historic Committee of Proctors meant a lot for me to do with my friend LeGrande Serras, who our community knows well as a fine restaurateur and a committed individual to the community, and has a long story that I want to make sure to extract for us about the block, the 400 block that Proctors is in the middle of. Hello, LeGrande.
How are you, Philip?
I'm fabulous. So tell me what you saw in some year before Canal Square.
Well, what had happened, and I was trying to recall the early years of Canal Square. The 1968 was the year that the Colony Center was opened, and those of us that were in the downtown Schenectady was booming.
What were you doing?
I owned Peggy's Restaurant, which is ultimately Aperitivo, and my family had owned it since 1945. So when we were here, we were starting to see the edges of downtown Schenectady getting eaten up. You know, the Barney's, which was down in the lower State Street area. Some of the Roth's restaurant, which many of the older people would remember, but they were starting to feel the effects of the Colony Center. If I'm not mistaken, it was about 71 or 72, Mohawk Mall opened up. And that was really that again was the start of the real deterioration. That's when we realized something better happened down here, because this was endemic of all of these downtown areas in the Northeast. The malls had come in at this point. The suburban malls had come in and just had done a number on all of the downtown. So we were approached at that point, several of us, by an architect here locally, Jim Duggan, I believe. And Jim was very friendly with a man from Washington, D.C., Arthur Cotton Moore, who was an architect who specialized.
Very famous,
very well known. Yeah. And that was his specialty, was downtown urban renewal. And Jim approached. There was Chuck Carl, Mr. Cushing, Jim Cushing from Cushing Stone, Mr. Flora, Joe Flora from Schenectady Savings Bank, and a few of the other people that were here in the 400 block area. Angelo Delario, who owned the Lafayette Men's Store, Paul Eisenberg, the Squire Shop, Jack and Kathy Sheehan.
From the Costumer.
From the Costumer, correct.
And this is all in the block from Broadway to
up to
Clinton.
At that point, they put together a meeting so that Arthur Cotton Moore could explain to us what he had done in other urban settings.
Now, all these buildings were occupied, but their businesses were starting to feel it.
Starting to feel it.
Yep.
As I said, Philip, the edges were already starting to disappear, and I'm going down that way.
So Peggy's had seen, just your own business had seen enough of a decline to go to this meeting.
Yeah, absolutely. And now, and here I am, 28 years old, I'm full of vim and vigor, ready to roll, and I'm starting to see, the same thing that everybody else was seeing, which was, what are we going to do now? And that was really the beginning of Canal Square, and how this project was and I think back as to the center of the whole project, of course, was Proctors Theater. And Proctors Theater at that particular point, and this is, some people have different thoughts as to what happened, but Proctors Theater at that point was scheduled for demolition. And I don't remember the exact year, but I do recall that, that this was not rumor, this was fact. And it was given
it had gotten to the point where it was just doing skin flicks.
That's correct. It was a porno theater,
right?
And there were very few of us that went, but
and you knew everybody else.
And I knew everybody. Yeah, exactly. So anyway, so it was really the the demise of what was going on. So we were working then, of course, with Mayor Ducey, and
So what did Moore present?
well, his whole thing is he came in with these pretty pictures, and this is what we can do. And of course, again, being the young, enthusiastic guy that I was, I'm impressed by all these pictures and what his view and what his concept was running this canal system that was going to be involved in this whole project, tying these properties all together so that there would be essentially the second floors would be a continuation of all of these hallways that would take you from one store to the other. So when we went to see some of his projects, of which the best known one was Canal Square down in Washington, Georgetown, and that of course was the final, you know, the final stake for us to say, okay, this is what we got to do. And this was first and second floor retail, with anything above that turned into offices or whatever. So we were sold, you know, and we embarked on putting up the kind of money that was necessary to get him to at least give us the initial schematics.
So what did well, how many were there? 8, 9 businesses, property owners?
Yeah, approximately. I mean, there were more people involved, but I think there probably that amount were the ones that came up with the initial money.
So they made a big leap, these 8 property owners.
Oh yeah. Oh
so
sure.
Describe it. What was that
well, leap? We needed, you know, I was a small-time businessman. I mean, you know, I think if I remember correctly, it was $50,000 we needed to come up with in order to hire this Arthur Cotton Moore. And at that point, you know, we had to make a decision as to who it was. Well, Mr. Cushing at that point was in for $15,000. Mr. Flora jumped in, $15,000. Mr. Carl jumped in. So now we're at 45. And then the rest of us had to come up with the other 5. And that was the start of the schematics to get rolling at that point. And then as I've told the story, we needed to go with all these pretty pictures that we had, and I went down to Washington and went to see, his name was, he was the head of HUD, Housing and Urban Development, Mr. Pierce. I think Franklin Pierce was his name. And I had all these pretty pictures, and I said, we need, you know, in order to get this thing rolling, we need $500,000. And after I gave my presentation, he said, no, he says, you need more than that. So he gave me $1 million. And I came back, and I'm a 28-year-old kid. You know, what do I know? And so we came back with this wonderful grant. I should have asked for $10 million. I would have probably gotten that too.
And that was an Urban Development Action Grant, as I recall, a UDAG
yeah,
grant.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah. So, and that of course started the funding, and then there was a consortium of banks that were involved, and their role was to come in and pick up $11 million. So it was like a $12 million project. And the consortium fell apart. And ultimately, Mr. Keith, who was then the president of Schenectady Savings Bank, called me up, told me, we need to talk. So I went up there, and Mr. Keith said, I'm giving you the money. And he says, all I'm going to tell you from here on is sell that restaurant and get a effing haircut. Yes, Mr. Keith, absolutely.
So how long was your hair?
Yeah, longer than yours. So when Mr. Keith said it, you listened.
So talk about the structure, because the structure that you guys created was pretty unusual.
Yeah, what was so, the reason that it was so unusual, it was a grassroots effort that essentially that the owners of all these properties were going to turn their properties over to this 400 Block Development Corp. That was the entity. And that entity was based on what the value of those properties were worth less the mortgages. So what you were going to get back as a property owner, and this is why the government was so interested, is that there was a way of creating this entity, this 400 Block Development Corp., which was going to own it. The bank was not going to loan you money, or any other agency wasn't going to loan you money if everybody was an individual. It had to be put into a package. So this is when the city turned over Smith Street, the property, the streets, the buildings. So there was a value that was assessed to each of these properties. And whatever the mortgages that were left on these properties was paid off, and we were given shares of stock. So the shares of stock, if for instance, Peggy's was worth $50,000. I had a $10,000 mortgage on it. The mortgage was paid off. I received $40,000 worth of stock in this entity. That's why it was so interesting to the government, is they finally said, wow, this is a way that we can start to, as you said, the Housing and Urban Development Action Grants needed a way in order for this to happen. That's why it ended up becoming such a major project in the eyes of the government at that time. So that was the structure.
So let's walk through the businesses one more time, the things people will remember. So Peggy's, that was a building and a business,
right,
that participated.
That's correct. And then I owned the buildings next door to it, which had Burns Camera and the Travel Bureau. And I don't remember the name of the Travel Bureau. Paul Eisenberg, who owned the Squire Shop. Angelo Delario, who owned Lafayette Men's Store. Jim Cushing, who owned that big corner building, which at that time was, I think there was a coffee shop in there at the time. If I remember, Famiano and his wife owned it. There was a rug shop, Eli, I can't remember that. On the other side of Proctors, of course, was Key Bank. Next to that was Fox and Murphy. Next to that, of course, there was the Singer Sewing Shop, and there was a hobby store, if I remember correctly, and I don't recall the name of it. I had the picture of the guy in my head, but I can't. And then, of course, Lipstein's Liquor Store, which was up in the corner.
And so those were all the, oh, and in back, yeah.
And then now in the back, of course, you know, where the Carl companies were the warehouses, and some of the other Smith Street and the buildings that were across the street from there.
And I just learned today for the first time that included in the 400 block was Proctors.
That's correct.
The city had given
Proctors
to the 400 block
400
as part
block.
of
At
the
the time,
package.
that was when the whole issue with the building was needed tremendous repairs at that point. So we had some funds at that point. The 400 block had funds at that point, so it was turned over to the 400 block to turn, at least to get the building shored up. And then from there emanated the group that ultimately came in.
So it was always the plan that the Proctors would be a theater as part of the 400 block.
Yeah, and not only that, and I remember there was a big to-do, and I look back now and it was a mistake. When we had adopted the name of Canal Square, it shouldn't have been Canal Square. It should have been Proctor Square. And that was a mistake that we made in the beginning. Not that that would have changed anything, but the focus point of this always was Proctors, and we didn't capitalize on it enough, you know. So anyway.
So Canal Square, describe this thing that emerged.
Well,
I've only heard about it.
Yeah, of course.
Well, of course, that's not true. I also ran into it as we did redevelopment of Proctors.
Yeah, of course.
Underground, the canal is still there.
Yeah, when I look back, I mean, you know, Philip, I go back and I'll say it again. You know, here I am, I'm thrust into this entity. You know, I was 28, 29, 30 years old. I don't even remember at this point, but they made me president. And I'm thinking, you know, at the time, my head was so big, you know, it was like, I think I want to tell a side story. My head was so, because I was in the paper every day, I was on TV, I was doing interviews, I was out every night of the week. Well, my friends, of which Paul Eisenberg and a couple of the others that were involved, what they ended up doing was that they ended up getting some stationery from Time magazine down in New York City. And on the stationery, it said, "Dear Mr. Serras, we've been following your career very closely, and it appears to us appears to us that we could, we'd love to do the story on what has happened in, in downtown Schenectady. Unfortunately, we've only have a one-way ticket for your plane to be flown down, but our private plane will fly you back. And would please come into our offices so we can do this. And of course, I show up at Time Magazine, you know, because I got this letter and I got my pretty pictures. And I go upstairs and I walk in and I said, I'm LeGrande Serras. I'm meeting with Joe Smith. They go, who? Joe Smith. I said, I'm going to be interviewed for this project. And they said, we don't know what you're talking about. I said, then I realized, son of a bee. And of course, my wife at the time was involved in it, so I only had $22 in my wallet because I always carried cash. But I never looked. And of course, here I am with $22. That was, the bus was $20 to come from New York back to downtown Schenectady. And they're all waiting down at the bus station for me to come back. That bastards. Anyway.
That's a great one.
Well, that was part of the deal. But anyway, it taught me a little humility. But anyway, so the structure itself was, I said, when we finally came up with this formula, is to get, you know, is to come up with a way of making this entity work. But as far as the physical aspects of it, was trying to tie all these properties together to make it look like an urban setting and an urban mall. And of course, the real focal point was the canal, supposedly, and that was the water element of the project. And it was great when it was built.
So describe it. Describe it when it was built.
Yeah,
10 foot wide, 8 foot wide. I don't remember. I don't know.
I don't recall specifically, but it went from the Clinton Street up Clinton and State behind the properties, and then wound its way around Smith Street, and then ultimately in the back of what was the Carl Company and the lower part of 400 Block Development Corp. So there was one big area on one side and one big area on the other side, and then the canal itself, which wound through the back on Smith Street and all the way back up to Lipstein's liquor store. And what we found is that the first year we became a public swimming pool for all of the people up on Hamilton Hill.
Was there supposed to be boats on it? A little.
Yeah, we had little paddle boats.
Paddle boats.
Yeah, and I ended up getting, I think, 4 or 5 of them that we had the paddle boats going in there. It was a beautiful project. I mean, it was a great project. Didn't make a dime, but you know, it was a.
And then there was a pond. There was the bigger section was behind Peggy's, as I remember.
That was the one big
drawings.
section, and the other big section was on the other side of Proctors, which was, again, if you walked out the side doors of Proctors, you walked into the other big pond, and that was the community swimming pool. So that was.
So I also heard rumor that it was never pumped adequately, so the water was green. And,
it was when we look back at it, it was beautiful to see at the very beginning, which was probably the first 2 months. After that, it was a disaster. The pump systems didn't work properly. We were growing some vegetables in there that you couldn't eat, but it was rough.
So how many years do you think the canal existed?
I'm going to say probably 2.
Two.
You know?
And then, as I recall, because it was still here when I came in 2002, the facade had a unifying.
Yeah, the coloring of it was
marquee kind of thing.
That's
that
correct.
Went across everywhere.
It was the facade was all in brown and gold, and each of the sign, of course, everything became very uniform to again create that whole idea of being a suburban urban mall. As I said, it was a wonderful looking project. Philip, the thing that I do know now, and you and I have talked privately about this, and I think I certainly can talk about it now. It didn't matter what we did. I have to accept that fact that GE at that point, we had seen our community go from 100,000 people down to 60 because GE, as you know, had moved their headquarters out of here overnight. 40,000 people. I mean, it wasn't overnight, but in a relatively
within
short
3-4
time.
years.
So, you know, it was just an aggregate of a lot of things that were going on in our communities, which were going on in many of these Northeast communities, that our city started to suffer. And you know, I held myself responsible. You know, here I am, you know, being interviewed and on TV and on the radio and all that, and overnight is like we're facing bankruptcy. And the only thing that, of course, that was successful was Proctors Theater, because people wanted that, you know, they wanted that venue to work. So we had this magnificent project, but many of, you know, that it just wasn't able to sustain itself.
Well, I have to tell you, from the Proctor side, a piece of the canal story that you may not fully know, but when the canal got built behind Proctor Stage, there was a bridge over the canal that was, so if the canal was 8 feet wide, the bridge probably went 3 feet high or 4 feet high, looking at pictures, that got from Smith Street to
The inside.
inside. And it was the story of the industry, because people would go, oh, just wait until you get to Schenectady, because it would be winter and snowy and ice, and 5 tons of theatrical stuff had to be pushed up and then caught at the bottom side of this hill. Oh, it was pretty funny. People talked about it a lot.
Yeah, and now that you say that, I recall that being one of the real problems that we had. Yeah.
So ultimately, it did go bankrupt.
Yeah, and at that point, Schenectady Savings Bank, Mr. Keith was gone at that point. Mr. Flora was gone, and the president of the bank, who I'll leave nameless, called in the partners and said, "We're pulling the plug," and they did. And at that point, they ended up taking over, and it went through a number of different. Not different owners, but management. And I don't recall the names now, Philip, but...
So before the bankruptcy, from what I heard before we started our interview, the 400 Corp gave or sold the building, the Proctors building, to the Proctors not-for-profit board.
Correct.
So it ended up not being part of that bankruptcy.
No. It wasn't part of that was a separate entity and was cut out of this whole, was cut out of this entity, the 400 Block Development Corp., and that was the group of people that ultimately...
Well, it would have been very interesting if it was part of the corp of the
well, I don't think it could,
bankruptcy.
I'm not sure that it could have... I mean, from a standpoint from a business, it would have been involved in the bankruptcy. Now, as to whether or not...
Could have survived it.
It could have survived it, yeah, exactly. There wouldn't have been a group, that initial group that came in and raised the funds that were necessary in order for it to be preserved. Wouldn't have
Probably been a very different story
Yeah,
if it wasn't
different story,
cut out.
absolutely.
Very, very interesting.
Absolutely.
So you have another humbling story I need you to tell us. I'm sorry. And I think it happened on the day of the announcement of the bankruptcy, if I get that correct.
Well, yeah, it was around there. Well, we were named the project because of the structure. Unbeknownst to the government at that point, they saw this as being the answer, which it was the answer to all of these, or many of these urban projects that were trying to be put together. So the whole entity being this grassroots effort, giving the property over to an entity, this was named now Urban Development of the Year. I went down, and President Reagan was going to give me this citation. But those days that were centered around this is when Schenectady Savings Bank called me and told me we're pulling the plug. So here I am going down to Washington to receive this thing from President Reagan. Unbeknownst to the government, of course, is they're going to pull the plug on this whole thing, and they're giving us this citation for Urban Development of the Year. So of course, I didn't say anything. Here's President Reagan says, "That's a very handsome mustache." Anyway.
It is a very handsome mustache.
Yeah, very handsome mustache. So anyway, it was kind of certainly
There's a little more to the story, though, right?
Refresh my memory.
You flew home and no one was there to greet you?
No, that was exactly.
Your family was like, "What are you doing?"
Yeah, where are you from? Right, I'm here. I'm at the Albany airport, and I've got nobody there. I'm going back on my own. Even my close friends at that time, of which, as you know, Angelo at that time had taken over Peggy's, and Paul Eisenberg, and anyway. It was,
so you had your business before the bankruptcy. Had you moved your business?
Yeah, well, at that time, that's when I said to you, Mr. Keith had told me that you're going to sell your restaurant and you're going to take this project over. And that's when Angelo was working as a food and beverage manager at Union College. And at that time, I had to sell the store. And as it turned out, we were put together. This is 1979. And as you all know, Angelo and I, of course, are very dear friends. We're still housemates. Here we are. So anyway, that's how he got started, because he didn't have any money, So we hit it off. He was just an incredible energy, vision. So it was quite something.
So you've shared some of looking back on Canal Square, but take one more cut at it. The notion of aggregating buildings in downtowns is really smart, because so many of them don't meet code unless you can do an aggregation. They need elevators, and an elevator for one thin building is insanity if you could make it work for 3 or 4. But so the idea was right, as you suggested.
The concept was the concept was great. I mean, we received Urban Development of the Year specifically because of the structure, as to how you could put something like that together, and as to what would have been. And again, I see now with many of the things that you have done and the people here at Proctors have done in order to incorporate a lot of these upper floors into. I just read about the Addy. Brilliant, And again, it just, those are things that if we could have done that perhaps at the beginning, if we were farsighted enough to see that if you could create this theatrical space that would have incorporated many of these properties, which has been done, and probably maybe couldn't have been done at those early years. I mean, maybe this would have to have been the natural course of action that would have taken all of these years in order to accomplish.
Yeah, I have that sense. I have a sense not of Canal Square as failure, but as process. Because we didn't know. I mean, all of us. And if younger people didn't decide downtowns were okay, if certain kind of attitude about housing in downtowns didn't happen, Proctors would have been alone, which might not have been a good thing.
Well, no, and that perhaps is the case. You got to remember, and I say it on behalf of the Greek community. What some of the towns had done, some of the cities had done in those early years is there was a whole community of Greeks and Italians that lived over where the police station is and all in that area over there. This was before you had come, but there's a very large group of people that were here. They were wiped out, because of what we thought was urban development. And it came in, and many of the viewers will remember 2 guys came in, wiped out the whole Italian and Greek community. And 2 guys, how many years did it last? I don't know, 3, 4 years at that point. But meanwhile, we eliminated all of them. So the whole idea of looking back now we have 30 years longer. We should have been more prudent in the way, and I'm talking about we being all these downtowns, that we should have been more prudent about how we structured this. I just, coming in here, I always love to tell the story that, you know, the 3 or 4 people that stopped me and said, you know, LeGrande, come on back downtown, you know. I'm at this point in my career, I'm done, I'm finished, but I feel so good when I come to downtown Schenectady, and I feel so good about walking in through here and seeing all of the things that have happened and all the positive things that have happened. And then when someone, as I said, a couple of people that stopped me on the way in said, do you like what's happened down here? I said, I love it. I just absolutely love it. You know, and I'm so proud of our community and how it's gone forward, and of course certainly what's happened here at Proctors.
Well, thank you, LeGrande. Thanks for your time. We're going to go on a tour of the Addy after this. Thank you for joining us. The Historical Committee is documenting the history of this block, this town, and this great theater, Proctors.